I am happy to join with you today in what will go down in history as the greatest demonstration for freedom in the history of our nation. I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. I have a dream that one day on the red hills of Georgia, the sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will be able to sit down together at the table of brotherhood. I have a dream that one day, even the state of Mississippi, a state sweltering with the heat of injustice, sweltering with the heat of oppression, will be transformed into an oasis of freedom and justice. I have a dream. My poor little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream today.
Martin Luther King Jr. was an American civil rights activist who famously gave the I Have a Dream speech on August 28, 1963, in front of the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C. On January 15, 1929, King was born in Atlanta, Georgia. In 1955, he helped organize the first major protest of the African American civil rights movement, the Montgomery bus boycott. King gave this speech during the previously planned March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom that was intended to bring all people together to fight for the civil rights movement. The people who organized the march were religious and labor rights leaders and civil rights activists. In his speech, he implemented references to the country's founding fathers and the Bible. He used universal topics to depict the struggle of African Americans. MLK carefully chose this location because the Lincoln Memorial includes inscriptions for the Gettysburg Address and the Second Inaugural Address. It stressed that 100 years earlier, in 1863, all men are created equal and slavery is a violation of these principles. He did this to draw attention that 100 years later, blacks still lack basic freedom in the United States. This was important that there were public demonstrations drawing attention to the issues that the bill was intended to fix, such as eliminating school segregation, prohibiting discrimination during job hiring, and fair pay regardless of race. His speech brought greater attention to the civil rights movement. It made Congress move faster in passing the Civil Rights Act. This set of laws was finally passed in the next year, in 1964. Many of these laws gave African Americans more equal treatment than they ever had before. Martin Luther King continued to speak out for civil rights and for nonviolence. Sadly, he was killed in 1968, but the memory of his famous I Have a Dream speech and the message it contains live on.
On July 2, 1964, President Lyndon B. Johnson put into law the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which was one of the biggest civil rights achievements in U.S. history. After Congress approved this law, Attorney General Robert Kennedy stated that this law will be a challenge for the United States to eliminate the last vestiges of injustice in our beloved country, implying that it will be a challenge for many people to incorporate this new norm, which contradicts what they had been previously taught about race, gender, and religion. This law was put into place in the state of Washington, D.C., in the White House press office. This Civil Rights Act made it illegal to discriminate on the basis of race, color, religion, gender, or national origin, which resulted in the termination of discrimination across work and public facilities, and ultimately changed voter registration requirements. This act was extremely beneficial to the civil rights movement and for the future of the United States, because it was a huge step forward for the African American goal to end discrimination and create equality for all. One way in which this act is still in effect today is that it is a part of the 14th Amendment to the United States Constitution. This implies that discrimination and segregation is unlawful and has changed many people's mindsets and/or opinion on race, gender, and religious stereotypes in today's world.
Gangster, preacher, and revolutionary, Malcolm X is one of the most prominent racial activists in modern history and a symbol of Black liberation who has inspired generations. Malcolm X was born in 1925 in Omaha, Nebraska. His parents, like him, were outspoken activists who received countless death threats from white supremacy groups. When Malcolm was just 4 years old, the Ku Klux Klan burned down his home. At age 6, his father was murdered by a white supremacist group named the Black Legion, and at age 13, his mother was put into a medical institution, leaving he and his 8 siblings to be split up into foster homes. And on top of that, 4 of his uncles were also murdered. At 16, Malcolm dropped out of high school and moved to Boston when a teacher told him his one dream of being a Black lawyer was unrealistic. And at age 18, he became involved in gambling, drug dealing, and pimping. And after countless robberies, he landed himself in a Boston jail for 6.5 years. After Malcolm's release from prison in 1952, he began the practice of Islam. And due primarily to his efforts, the Nation of Islam grew from a mere 400 members to 40,000 by 1960. An articulate and popular public speaker, Malcolm X expressed the frustration and anger of African Americans during the major phase of the civil rights movement from 1955 to 1965. He strongly advocated the separation of Black and white Americans and rejected parts of the civil rights movement for its emphasis on integration of whites and Blacks. In a stark counterpoint to Martin Luther King's philosophy of nonviolence, Malcolm X said, "I am for violence if nonviolence means we continue postponing a solution to the American Black man's problem." Malcolm encouraged Black men to use any means necessary to protect themselves. His ideology forged an assertive revolution to stand up and fight to win equality for all oppressed minorities. Malcolm's call to fight and protect oneself inspired millions of African Americans. Even those who disagreed with him respected him as a person. After deep tensions with Elijah Muhammad over the political direction of the Nation of Islam, Malcolm left the Islamic Nation in 1964. Just as Malcolm X appeared to be embarking on an ideological transformation with the potential to dramatically alter the course of the civil rights movement, he was seen as a threat to the Nation of Islam, and members plotted to assassinate him. On February 21, 1965, Malcolm X took the stage for a speech at the Audubon Ballroom in Manhattan. He had just begun addressing the room when 3 Islamic men rushed the stage and shot him at close range 21 times. In his 39 years of life, Malcolm was speaking to all races, not about civil rights, but human rights. He challenged and fought against racial injustice and was prepared to die for his beliefs. Malcolm X inspired millions of African Americans to figure out their self-worth and led people to demand more from the United States. As protests over racial issues continue in America, Malcolm X's legacy continues to inspire. When asked about the relevance of Malcolm X today, Alicia Garza, who helped organize the hashtag Black Lives Matter movement, seems like she doesn't know where to begin. Malcolm X went from being a petty criminal to an internationally celebrated voice against racism and colonialism.